In the group C, we had the game between Levon Aronian and Vidit Gujrathi. We had the Nimzo-Indian opening. After this, e6, knight c3 and bishop b4. And Levon chose the Rubinstein variation with e3, castling and bishop d3. The downside of this variation is that his bishop is very passive on c1. But the upside is that he's developing his king side very quickly, and one of his ideas in this opening is to go for f3 e4 to have a good center. Vidit plays d5, and now Aronian takes and goes for a3. Provokes black to take on c3, but he doesn't do it. He goes for bishop d6, queen c2, and now c6, stopping knight b5 at some point. Knight e2 and rook e8 by black. Bishop d2 by Levon, and now b6. Black wants to use his bishop, but he doesn't have a good way to do it, because if he goes to g4, he just provokes white to go for f3 and have some attack with g4, takes, h4. He will castle on the next move, play h5, and it will become really unpleasant for black. Also, what's possible for white here is to just push for e4 in the center. He has lots of options in this case. He doesn't want to induce f3 g4. He goes b6. He tries to exchange this bishop by bishop a6. Now white castles. Now bishop a6. King h1. A typical waiting move in these positions before he tries to go for some pawn break eventually. And now c5. Black tries to get some play before white tries to get f3 e4 in. He weakens the d5 pawn, but also he opens up the position, and the position becomes more dynamic than static. Rook a d1 and now g6, threatening c4 next to trap the bishop. So that's why Levon plays queen b1 first, to have this outpost for the bishop. Vidit goes to b7, tries to support the d5 pawn, and Aronian plays knight f4, tries to tickle this d5 pawn, and Vidit continues developing by knight bd7. It was interesting to play bishop f4, and after this to play knight c6. But maybe Vidit didn't like this because of dc, bc and f5, and the position becomes quite sharp. The bishop is now much more active, and perhaps that's something that Vidit didn't like. White having the bishop pair with g6 being played already, it's not very pleasing. So that's why he played this, and now f3. Vidit goes to f8, tries to find a better square for his knight, because on d7 it's quite limited by the d4 pawn, and it maybe wants to get to e6 next. And now Levon plays b4, tries to provoke black to fix the center by c4, and after bishop c2, now the e4 break is much easier to get. The center is fixed, unlike in this position where d4 is always under some pressure. And now Vidit is forced to react. How to recapture? He recaptured on d4, and now he took on f4. Also, it's possible to go for something like rook c8 or knight e6, but he took on f4, and now we got massive exchanges. After knight h5, it's better to keep the bishop on this diagonal, because if you go back to d2, there is queen h4, a very unpleasant move which attacks d4 and threatens knight g3. So bishop had to stay on e5, but after f6 they exchange light pieces, and after queen c7, knight e2. The issue for black in this position is that his bishop on b7 is very passive. Also, his pawn on d5 is on the light square, which limits his bishop. Black played rook e3, but white just stabilizes very nicely. Queen a2, rook a e8, queen d2, queen d6, and now rook c1. First he gets the c file. Rook goes to e7, and now bishop b5. Now he wants to go rook c2 or rook c3, rook fc1, and to control the c file. That's why Vidit plays rook c8, they exchange, and now queen f4, offering the trade which Vidit can hardly refuse, because the f6 pawn is also under some attack. He took, and now he went back to b7. And now the position simplified, but the problems remain the same for black. Black's pawn on d5 is weak, bishop on b7 is quite bad when you compare it to the bishop on b5. And now white just needs to stabilize his position to cover e3 square. Vidit played king f7. Now if black tries to get some counterplay with rook e3, there is king f2. And if rook a3, after rook e1, position becomes really unpleasant because rook e7 comes next and the bishop is alone there. That was no good for black, so he went for king f7 first. King f2, now he's stopping the rook e3 break. And black went for knight e6, trying to exchange even more pieces. At least to exchange the attacker on d5. Rook h1 by Aronian, and now h5. Bishop d3, which attacks on g6 and forces black to exchange. Because if he defends passively by this, then at least white can go rook c1 and put some additional pressure by a4, a5 on the queen side. So he wants to exchange pieces, gf, and now he makes a huge mistake. He plays rook c7. It was better to go for f5, completely closing the position. One of the ways that white can go here is to play g4, but it doesn't help too much, because after fg, all these exchanges, rook h7, here takes, bishop g6, eventually black is going to lose this g pawn, but the nature of position is very closed. And after king f6, let's say bishop d3, bishop c8, king g3, you can just shuffle with your bishop. Even if you achieve this perfect scenario with bishop g4, bishop c2, bishop f3, bishop b4, it's not clear how white can improve in this position. The king will just hold, will just sit on f6, and there's no way to improve this position. But Vidit plays rook c7 here, which allowed Aronian to play f5 to break these pawns. And now after g5, he took a pawn. Now rook h7 is a strong threat, so king g7 had to be played. Rook h1 by white. He tried with this, but after king e2, now it's bad to capture on a3 because of rook c1, having rook c7 next. And in case of bishop a6, you have b5 always, completely shutting down this bishop. And the best that black can do is to capture here, but after this, bishop b5, king e3, this is a dead lost position. Black played bishop c6, trying to somehow improve his bishop. Rook a1 now. Bishop d7, and now king d2. The rook cannot stay on the third rank because of king c2. So he has to go back to c8, but now the b pawn starts running and the bishop is completely locked in. Rook h8 tries to get some counterplay on the king side. g4, and he must go back because there is no use of rook h3 because of simply king e3. And what do you do? a4, a5 comes next and puts pressure on b6. So he went back to c8, and now Levon plays a4, tries to make a weakness on this side. Black has two weaknesses, d5 and bishop on d7, so it's time to make the third weakness, which is one of these two pawns. King f8 and now a5. Now if he takes, after rook takes, rook c7, there is f6 weakness as well. It's tough to hold this position. It's really tough. Also, you might even create a passed pawn by king e3, f4. And black is paralyzed completely. So he went for king e7, he was waiting for things to happen. Levon took, and rook a7. He wanted to go rook b7 to hit the b6 pawn. That's why black plays rook b8. And now it's time to create a passed pawn. King d6 by Vidit, f4. We have a check, but eventually he will get the g passed pawn. There is a threat, like I said, rook b7. And here Vidit tries the last trick. He took on b5. Bishop b5, and now imagine that there's no rook on the board. If there's no rook on the board, this is stalemate. So what does black do? Black wants to sacrifice his rook, like a desperado. He goes rook e4 first. King goes to f3, now rook f4. He doesn't allow Aronian to get to g3 because he would just capture the pawn. So he goes back to e3, rook e4, king f2, rook f4, and now king e1. He's meeting rook e4 by bishop e2. Also, rook f1 is impossible because of bishop takes f1, and the king has moves to play now. So he decides to capture on d4 because there was a threat of rook d7 checkmate. So he takes here rook a4, and now black is forced to exchange rooks. Takes, king e5, king d2, and after king f4, he just defends the pawn. Vidit goes on to play more moves, but it's dead lost now. King d3, king e5, king c4, and after this, king e3. Because after, let's say, king e5, there is Zugzwang with bishop d3. And black has to give up the d4 pawn or b5 pawn, or both. So he went for e3, but after bishop b1, he resigned because this is a simple Zugzwang. If the king moves, then you lose the d4 pawn. If you push this one, you can take, and then just capture, and push g5. After which black's pawn is too slow. So that's it. The crucial mistake was allowing white to play f5. In this position, black allowed f5. Black didn't play f5, blocking the position, and allowed white to push f5 himself. Thank you so much for watching, and see you soon in the next video. Bye.